I was the broke husband who supposedly ruined our lives with a failed business, making me the laughingstock of all Chicago. Even as I hung from harness 30 stories up cleaning windows for $300 an hour just to pay for my mother's hospital bills, my life meant less to them than the fireworks at one of their parties. When my mother signed her organ donation papers on her deathbed, they actually had the nerve to wave stacks of cash around, trying to buy her heart as a backup for a socialite who was only faking her own illness. They never imagined that the man they discarded like trash would end up with enough evidence to burn Olivia Sterling's entire empire to the ground, all because of a secret inheritance my mother left me. My wife, Olivia, had supposedly failed at her startup and drained every cent of our savings. I took on 3 jobs at once just to keep us afloat and take the pressure off her. I worked myself to the bone every single day, desperate to carry as much of the weight as I could for her sake. One afternoon, I was dangling 30 stories up, swaying precariously on steel cables while scrubbing the exterior windows of a skyscraper. As I wiped away years of grime from the glass, I happened to glance inside. A lavish birthday party was in full swing right on the other side of the pane. At first, I felt a pang of envy and just watched for a moment, but then my blood turned to ice. There was my wife, Olivia, pushing a massive tiered cake through the room. It was not covered in frosting. Instead, every single layer was made of tightly rolled $100 bills. She moved the cake to the center of the room toward an elderly woman who sat like a queen, surrounded by adoring guests. Even through the thick, reinforced glass, I could hear the muffled roar of the celebration. Renting a space like this in downtown Chicago cost a fortune that most people could never dream of. I saw a server nearby talking to a guest, and though I couldn't hear them, the signs were everywhere that Mrs. Sterling had booked the entire floor for her mother-in-law's birthday. From the stacks of cash envelopes I saw being handed out at the door, the party must have cost millions. Suspended in the air by nothing but a few cables, I went completely numb. None of those wealthy socialites knew that the real mother-in-law of Mrs. Sterling had actually passed away in a hospital bed only yesterday. That woman was my mother. Back at the hospital, she had gripped my hand with what little strength she had left and whispered, "Lucas, my boy, please stop. Do not spend another dime on me. I refuse to be a burden to you and Olivia anymore." I had been so focused on her condition, calling Olivia over and over again and begging her to bring our joint bank card so I could pay for the next round of treatment. In the few minutes it took for me to step out and try to find a signal, my mother climbed to the roof of the hospital and jumped. She had folded her coat neatly and left it on the edge of the roof, weighted down by a small stack of cash. When I found it, my hands wouldn't stop shaking as I counted the bills. There were 20s, 10s, 5s, and singles, all adding up to exactly $53. Olivia was nowhere to be found when I needed her most. I handled my mother's final arrangements in a total fog, and before I could even begin to grieve, I had to get back to work cleaning windows just to stay ahead of the debt. It was a dangerous gig, but it paid $300 an hour. In my old life, $300 could feed us for a week. Seeing Olivia in that gold-plated 5-star hotel made me feel like I was hallucinating. Was this woman who was tossing cash around like confetti the same person who shared a bowl of instant noodles with me in our cramped apartment just yesterday, wearing a faded, patched-up hoodie? A sudden gust of wind whipped around the edge of the skyscraper, dragging me back to the cold reality of my harness. I shivered and pulled out my phone with numb fingers to call Olivia one more time. It went straight to voicemail again. My coworker in the lift saw me on my phone and immediately signaled the foreman on the roof. Within seconds, the cables groaned as we were hauled back up to the top of the building. As soon as my boots hit the concrete, a hard hat came flying at my face. The foreman screamed that I was a dead man for using a phone on the job and told me I was fired on the spot. The hard hat clipped my forehead, leaving a stinging, bloody gash. The sharp pain made me gasp, and I realized then that this was not some fever dream. This was my actual life. I stumbled toward the elevator with my head spinning. When I reached the lobby, I ran into a group of hotel employees who were buzzing with excitement. They told me to hurry over because Mrs. Sterling was handing out cash to anyone who offered a birthday greeting. I looked toward the ballroom, and the opulence was blinding. There were expensive ornaments and glittering trinkets everywhere, a display of wealth so excessive it felt like they were literally burning money. People around me were whispering about how the decorations alone must have cost more than most people make in a year. I pulled my face mask up to hide my features and joined the line of people heading toward the center of the room. When I finally reached the front, I saw Olivia standing there in a silk designer gown, draped in diamonds and pearls. She was standing next to the elderly woman, smiling with a level of grace and poise I had never seen before. My throat felt like it was filled with sand as I tried to speak. I managed to wish the woman a happy 60th birthday. I couldn't stop thinking that if my mother were still alive, she would be 60 this year too. My mother would have celebrated her 60th birthday this week. A few days ago, I had asked Olivia if we could afford a nice dinner for her, but my mother just shook her head and told me that paying off our debts would be the only gift she needed. Now, she was gone, and the world felt empty. Olivia didn't recognize my muffled voice, and she just gave me a brief, uninterested look before shoving a heavy envelope into my hands. She told me to take it and move along. My hands were trembling as I gripped the envelope. It was thick with $100 bills. A fraction of this money would have paid for the surgery that could have saved my mother's life, but here Olivia was handing it out like cheap party favors. Suddenly, someone behind me shoved forward to grab their own envelope, sending me sprawling across the polished marble floor. In my filthy, grease-stained work clothes, I looked like a pathetic stain on the beauty of the ballroom. Hundreds of wealthy guests stared down at me with a mixture of pity and disgust. The humiliation was a bitter pill to swallow as I tried to push myself up. Then, a hand appeared in my line of sight, and a voice asked if I was all right. I looked up and saw Dylan, the guest of honor and the old woman's son. Fate has a cruel sense of humor because I knew exactly who he was. This was the same Dylan that Olivia had convinced me to invest with, the man who had supposedly lost all our life savings in a bad deal. He was the one who had disappeared with our money, leaving my mother and me with nothing. It was all a setup. They were the winners, and we were the marks who couldn't even afford a hospital bill. I saw a flash of cold malice in Dylan's eyes, gone in an instant, but I knew what I saw. I ignored his hand and tried to stand up on my own, but someone in the crowd stuck out a foot and tripped me, sending me crashing back down to the floor. I landed on my back, feeling as helpless as a flipped turtle, while everyone laughed. Olivia started walking toward the commotion, the rhythmic clicking of her designer heels echoing against the marble floor. I scrambled to my feet and bolted for the exit. The last thing I wanted was for her to see me like this, broken and humiliated in front of her high society friends. As soon as I cleared the revolving doors, my phone buzzed with a friend request from a number I didn't recognize. I accepted it, and a video file immediately appeared in my messages. I opened the file and saw Olivia and Dylan wrapped in each other's arms. Dylan's voice came through the speaker as he asked her how much longer she was going to keep up the act of being a struggling, innocent wife. Olivia just giggled and told him that she never would have lasted this long with me if it hadn't been for the bet they had made. Her words felt like a serrated blade cutting through my chest. She went on, her voice turning ice cold as she complained about my mother's failing health. She said that if I ever found out she was rich, I would have used it to guilt-trip her into paying for the medical bills. I stood frozen on the sidewalk. She knew the whole time. Olivia knew my mother was dying, and she had seen every single desperate message I sent begging her for our money. She had simply watched them pop up on her screen and chose to do nothing. I made my way back to the damp basement apartment we called home. Looking at the peeling wallpaper and the low ceiling, I let out a hollow laugh. I almost had to admire her dedication to the role, living in this dump for 3 years just to win a bet. She was a brilliant actress. She had played the part of the loving daughter-in-law perfectly while living with my mother. She even lied and told us her parents were dead, so we would feel sorry for her. She used to tell us how much she cherished our family since she had been alone for so long. When her business supposedly went under, I sold our condo to cover her debts, and my mother even sold a precious family heirloom that had been passed down for generations. I will never forget the way she cried when I handed her that money. She sobbed and thanked us until she was breathless, swearing she was done with risky business ventures and only wanted a quiet life with me. The woman who had begged for our help was a complete stranger to the glowing socialite I had seen tonight. I looked around our pathetic little room and finally broke down. My sobs echoed against the empty walls of the basement. Life had been good before I met Olivia. I was the first in my family to graduate college and had built a decent career in Chicago, which allowed me to bring my mother to live with me in the city. We met at a corporate holiday party. She looked like a low-level clerk back then, cornered by some creep from management. She was wearing a cheap, faded outfit and looked absolutely terrified. I stepped in and pretended to be her friend to get the guy away from her. The look of gratitude in her eyes was something I'll never forget. A few weeks later, my mother saw her in the break room eating a dry sandwich and drinking tap water for lunch because she supposedly couldn't afford anything else. After that, my mother started making an extra lunch for her every day. We fell in love through those small gestures of kindness. Our wedding was small and simple, but Olivia told me it was the happiest day she had ever known. Shortly after we married, she said she wanted to start her own company. When it failed and we lost everything, my mother and I stood by her. We didn't know it was all just a game for the elite. I was the only person involved who was actually playing for keeps. My mother loved Olivia because she loved me, and she ended up paying for that love with her life. My phone buzzed while I was still crying. It was the hospital informing me that since my mother had signed an organ donation form, they had found a match and I needed to come say my final goodbye. Organ donation. I didn't even know she had signed up for that. I raced to the hospital, but as I arrived, I saw Olivia and Dylan stepping out of an ambulance together. Olivia was nearly running, her voice high and frantic. She was shouting that her mother-in-law was O-negative and had just collapsed. She demanded that every hospital in Chicago be searched for matching blood and organs immediately. She brushed right past me, her expensive perfume filling my lungs. If she had looked up for even a second, she would have seen her husband standing there like a ghost. But she never even glanced my way. She knew my mother was in this exact hospital and that she had died because we couldn't pay the bill. Yet, in Olivia's world, the only person worth saving was Dylan's mother. My legs felt like lead as I walked toward the morgue. A doctor and a nurse were waiting for me with the paperwork my mother had signed before she died. The doctor put a hand on my shoulder and told me my mother was a hero for what she was doing. He said her donation would save 3 different families. My fingers shook as I traced her signature at the bottom of the page where she had written Brenda Hall. The handwriting was shaky and uneven. I remembered how she had practiced for weeks just to learn how to sign her name, so she could help me with my student loans years ago. Now she was gone forever. She had fallen so far that I couldn't even bring myself to look at her body. I couldn't hold it in anymore and collapsed to the floor, sobbing until I couldn't breathe. The doctor's eyes filled with tears as he watched me. He didn't know what to say, so he just held my hand while I grieved. After a long time, I finally wiped my face and looked up at the staff. I apologized for making a scene and thanked them for their kindness. I tried to force a small smile and said that my mother would have been happy to know she was helping so many people. The room went silent as everyone paid their respects to her memory. Just as they were about to take the organs to surgery, a man in a sharp suit came rushing down the hall. He asked for the donor's next of kin and zeroed in on me immediately. He walked over with an arrogant air of confidence, acting as if he was about to do me the biggest favor of my life. He told me that Mrs. Sterling's mother-in-law needed a backup heart in case of an emergency. He said Olivia was willing to pay $5 million right then and there to secure my mother's heart. He looked at me like it was a done deal, assuming no one would turn down that kind of money. He was shocked when I looked him in the eye and said no. I told him the heart was already going to someone who actually needed it, and no amount of money would change my mind. I looked out the window at the waiting ambulance and told him that since my mother's life wasn't worth anything to Olivia, they should go find another heart to buy. My voice was completely flat and empty. I couldn't believe they were still trying to buy their way out of everything. Olivia was willing to spend $5 million just to have a spare heart sitting around for Dylan's mother, while my mother died for lack of a few thousand. I let out a bitter laugh, remembering how I had nearly crawled on my knees to beg her for a tiny fraction of that amount. I wondered how many more lies Olivia had been hiding from me all these years. The assistant scowled and shoved a stack of bills into my hand, telling me that money was no object for someone like Olivia Sterling. He reminded me that she was the most powerful woman in the city and always got what she wanted. I let his words hang in the air for a moment before replying that she was also the woman who had made a fool out of me. I told him again that this was my mother's final wish and I was going to see it through. We were at a standoff until the doctor came back out looking pale. He told me that the hospital administration had just ordered him to put the donation on hold immediately. Before I could even ask why, someone shoved me hard and I hit the concrete floor. Then, a shower of cash started falling on me like green rain, bills fluttering down and covering my body. The assistant stood over me and sneered, asking if I really thought a nobody like me could challenge Olivia Sterling. He told me that Dylan was the love of her life, and that his mother was far more important than mine. He laughed and said the cash on the floor was more than enough to buy a dozen hearts like my mother's. I sat there on the cold floor surrounded by money, the scent of fresh ink mixing with my tears as they hit the ground. Just one of the envelopes she had been tossing around at the hotel would have saved my mother. The assistant reached down and grabbed the medical cooler containing her heart and started to walk away. I lunged at him and grabbed his arm, screaming that it was my mother's heart and he couldn't have it. My mind was racing, and all I knew was that I had to protect the last piece of her that remained. He kicked me squarely in the chest, trying to pry the cooler from my fingers. I held on with everything I had even as my head spun and blood started to trickle into my eyes. My mother's heart was not a commodity for Olivia to trade for favors. It was meant to save a life, not to be a spare part for Dylan's mother. As we struggled, I heard the familiar sound of designer heels clicking down the hallway. Olivia's voice called out, asking Mark if he had finished with the donor's family yet. I tried to scream her name, desperate to ask her what more she wanted from me and why she wouldn't just let my mother die with some dignity. I barely got the first syllable of her name out before the assistant signaled 2 guards. They tackled me and pinned me to the floor. Mark leaned down and hissed that I wasn't going to be complaining to anyone today. He told the guards to get me out of there so Olivia wouldn't have to look at something so pathetic. I kept screaming that I was her husband and told them to ask her, but they just ignored me. Mark looked at my tattered clothes with pure disgust and laughed. He told me that even the janitors at their office dressed better than I did, so there was no way a loser like me could be married to a woman like Olivia Sterling. He signaled the guards, and they started dragging me toward the exit. As I was hauled away, I could hear Olivia's voice from the other room, sharp and demanding. She told Mark to offer whatever it took, because she wanted that heart secured no matter the cost. Mark apologized profusely, explaining that some crazy person had been making a scene and claiming to be her husband. Under her cold stare, he added that the man had also claimed the heart belonged to her mother-in-law. Olivia whispered that it was impossible. Mark felt relieved and quickly agreed, saying the guy was a complete mess and looked like a beggar. He told her there was no way she could be related to someone that low. He said that she and Dylan were the only ones who really belonged together. Olivia had been about to walk away, but she suddenly stopped and grabbed Mark by the arm, asking him to repeat what he had just said. Mark smiled and said that everyone knew how much she loved Dylan. At that moment, something clicked in Olivia's mind, and a look of realization washed over her face. She finally remembered the life she had been ignoring. She frantically pulled out her phone and started scrolling through her messages. She looked at the last text I had sent begging for help and realized that I hadn't sent a single word since then. Something was horribly wrong. Normally, if she didn't answer for an hour, I would have called her a dozen times out of concern. I had a habit of waiting for her at the corner every night ever since she told me a fake story about being followed by some creeps. I never knew those guys were just actors she had hired to make me feel protective of her. She snapped back to the present and dialed my number without thinking. Her plan was to just ask about my mother and then send over some money with a convenient excuse for why she had been busy. Dylan's mother was the priority, but she figured she could check on my mother later that evening. She tried to ignore Mark's description of the man in the hallway, telling herself that if I just picked up the phone, everything would be fine. The phone started ringing and she felt a surge of hope, but no one answered. Then she realized the sound of the ringtone was coming from just around the corner. She followed the noise into the next hallway. My phone was lying on the floor next to a fresh smear of blood. The two guards were standing nearby, looking guilty and staring at the blood on their hands. They apologized and told her that the man had bolted as soon as he heard her voice. Olivia's hands began to shake as she looked down at the cracked screen of my phone. The screen was shattered, but it was still in the case that matched hers, the very first gift she had ever given me. She snatched it up from the floor, her eyes wide with fear. She screamed at the guards, demanding to know where the owner of the phone was and what they had done to him. They were so terrified by her rage that they couldn't even get a word out. Mark finally spoke up and told her that the man had refused to hand over the heart and had been using her name to make trouble. So he had ordered the guards to teach him a lesson. Olivia looked at the medical cooler in Mark's hand. She saw the donor's name on the label and ripped it out of his grasp. She stared at the name for a long moment before whispering Brenda Hall. That was my mother's name. The realization hit Olivia like a physical blow. She remembered my mother making her soup just a few days ago, a meal that she had tossed in the trash because she thought it was too simple. Olivia was used to fine dining, and my mother's cooking was beneath her. She saw a doctor walking by and grabbed him by the arm, desperate for answers. She asked where the donor was and demanded to see her. The doctor looked at her with a somber expression and explained that the woman had committed suicide because she couldn't afford her medical bills. He told her that the fall had been so bad that she was unrecognizable and advised her not to see the body. Olivia felt the world spinning around her as she begged the doctor to repeat what he had said. The doctor hesitated and asked if she was family. Olivia didn't even hesitate as she told him she was the daughter-in-law and that Brenda Hall was her family. Before he could answer, Dylan came running out of the patient room. He gave Mark a quick look and then grabbed Olivia's hand, asking if she had secured the heart yet because his mother was getting worse. Olivia pulled her hand away from him and told him that this heart was off limits. She promised to find another donor for his mother, her voice trembling with emotion. Dylan looked annoyed for a split second before putting on a concerned face. He asked if there was something wrong with the heart and apologized for the trouble his mother's birthday party had caused. Olivia tried to calm him down, promising him that money was no object and she would find a heart for his mother. Dylan realized he shouldn't push her while she was in this state and just nodded in agreement. He tried to lead her back into the room to see his mother, but for the first time in her life, Olivia felt disgusted by his touch and pulled away. Her mind was a mess of terrifying questions. Why was my phone there? Why had my mother jumped? She tried to tell herself it was just because we were poor, but the truth was starting to settle in. She told Dylan she had something important to do and left him there. She ran out of the hospital as if she were being chased and drove straight to our apartment. She had never felt such a desperate need to see me. When she reached our basement door, her hand was shaking so much she couldn't even get the key in the lock. It took her several tries before she finally got inside. The lights were on, and she called out my name as she burst into the room. The only response was the sound of her own voice echoing in the empty apartment. She searched the tiny apartment frantically before collapsing onto the floor in tears. Then she saw a stack of papers on the table. When she picked them up, she saw the title, Divorce Papers. I'd just been there. She felt a sudden surge of adrenaline and ran back out into the street, desperately looking for me in the dark. She ran through the neighborhood in her heels, ignoring the pain in her ankles as she called out my name over and over again to the empty streets. She didn't even know what she was feeling anymore. She just knew that she had to find me and fix everything before it was too late. My phone rang in her pocket just as she was about to give up. When she answered it, the doctor's voice told her that because the heart hadn't been stored properly during the struggle, it was no longer viable for transplant. Olivia couldn't even speak. The doctor assumed I was just overcome with grief and tried to offer some comfort, saying that the loss of the heart was a tragedy that no one had wanted. The doctor told her that her other organs had already saved 2 families and that she would have been proud. He added that her only wish had been for me and my wife to be happy together and urged me to stay strong. Olivia stared at the phone, feeling like a monster. She could have saved everything with a single phone call or by spending a tiny bit of her fortune, but she had chosen to play her game instead. The woman who had treated her like a daughter and sold her only treasure to help her was gone forever. Olivia called Mark and demanded a full investigation into why the heart had been ruined. Then she remembered where I had said I was working and raced to the site. She remembered me telling her about a high-paying job I had taken to help with our finances. By dawn, she finally got a hold of my old boss. He told her that I had already quit after being nearly killed on the job at the Pinnacle Tower because I was distracted while hanging from the building. Olivia felt like she couldn't breathe. The Pinnacle Tower was the exact building where she had held the party for Dylan's mother. She realized then that I had seen everything from the other side of the glass. She didn't even remember hanging up the phone. She just stood on the street corner as the sun came up, but the light did nothing to warm the ice in her veins. She couldn't stop thinking about the ridiculous party and the way she had tossed money around like it was garbage. Standing there in the middle of the morning commute, she raised her hand and slapped herself across the face as hard as she could. I wouldn't have felt sorry for her even if I had seen it. I woke up in a hospital bed with no idea how I got there. Every inch of my body was screaming in pain, and I could barely move my jaw to speak. The memory of everything came rushing back, and I tried to jump out of bed to find my mother. My legs gave out the second my feet hit the floor, and I crashed onto the tiles. The sound brought someone running into the room. A doctor in a white coat rushed in and helped me back into bed, telling me I needed a rest. I stared at her for a moment before I realized she was the same doctor who had helped me before. She was the one who had paid my registration fee when I was broke and begging Olivia for help. I looked at her name tag and thanked Dr. Sarah Hayes, promising her that I would pay her back as soon as I could. She just gave me a kind smile and told me she had taken care of my injuries. She said she had heard about my mother and offered her condolences. I tried to smile and tell her I was okay, even though I felt like my world was over. As soon as Dr. Hayes left the room, I ripped the 4 out of my arm and bolted for the door. I didn't care about the blood. I had to go back and get my mother's heart. When I found the doctor from the night before, he just looked at me with pure guilt and apologized. I walked away like a zombie and wandered up to the VIP floor until I found the room where Dylan's mother was staying. The door was slightly ajar, and I heard Dylan telling his mother to put on more pale makeup, so Olivia would believe she was actually sick. My entire world shattered into pieces in that moment. I peeked through the gap and saw his mother applying white powder to her face in the mirror. She looked perfectly healthy until she smeared the makeup on to look deathly ill. She laughed and swatted Dylan's arm playfully. She told him that she only agreed to the plan because he was worried Olivia was actually falling for me. She joked that pretending to have a heart condition was bad luck, but she was doing it for him anyway. It was all a lie. She was never sick. They had staged the entire thing just to make a fool of me in front of Olivia. I stood there in the hallway, laughing and crying at the same time at how much of a joke my life had become. Everything felt meaningless now. My mother and I had loved Olivia like family, and that love was exactly what had killed my mother. I was about to kick the door in and confront them when I heard a shaky voice call my name from behind. I didn't even bother to look back. I threw the door open and stormed into the room, calling Dylan a son of a bitch. I grabbed him by the collar and landed a heavy punch right on his jaw. I screamed at him for what he did to my mother's heart and her final wish. Dylan didn't even try to fight back. He just collapsed to the floor and started crying for Olivia to save him. I was seeing red as I kept hitting him. His mother, who was supposed to be on her deathbed, leaped out of bed and started clawing at me to get me off her son. Dylan looked up at me and sneered that I would never know what it felt like to have real power. He told me that with just a snap of his fingers, Olivia would give him anything he wanted, something that a loser like me and my dead mother would never understand. A loud slap echoed through the room. Dylan clutched his cheek and stared at Olivia in total shock, asking her if she had actually just hit him because of me. Olivia stood between us like a human shield. She looked at Dylan with a cold, hard expression and told him to never speak about my mother like that again. She made it clear that she wouldn't tolerate another word of disrespect toward her. Her confession didn't move me at all. There was a time when those were the only words I ever wanted to hear from her, but now they felt hollow. She used to tell me she was too shy to say she loved me. Even at our wedding, she couldn't bring herself to say it in front of our friends. I had spent years thinking that if I just loved her enough, she would eventually say the words. I never imagined that when she finally did say it, it would mean nothing to me. I walked past her and told Dylan that his time was up. I told him I was calling the cops to get justice for my mother and that he was going to pay for everything. Olivia surprised me by handing over a folder. She told me it contained everything she had found out about what had happened. She took full responsibility for Dylan's actions and told me to blame her for everything. I took the papers without saying a word, my expression like stone as I walked out the door. If she thought this was going to make things right between us, she was delusional. As I left the room, Dr. Hayes came running toward me. I tried to explain, but she started scolding me immediately for being out of bed. She pointed out that I had ripped my stitches open again and forced me back to my room. I could feel Olivia watching me as I walked away, but I didn't look back. By the time I was released from the hospital, Dylan had already been arrested. I knew Olivia was the one who made it happen because she was the only one with that kind of power. It felt like a nightmare that the woman I had been married to for 3 years was actually the billionaire Nicole Sterling. I let out a disgusted snort as I walked out of the hospital, clutching the urn containing my mother's ashes. Olivia was waiting for me at the entrance. She told me she had already bought a burial plot for my mother. I didn't argue with her because she had all the money anyway. I told her to send me $200. Her face lit up and she quickly pulled out her phone. When a notification came through, I saw she had sent me $2 million instead. She didn't know the meaning of the word subtle. I didn't say anything to her. I just opened my app and sent $200 to Dr. Sarah Hayes to pay her back for the registration fee. Once the payment went through, I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Olivia handled all the funeral arrangements and made sure my mother was buried in the most beautiful part of the cemetery. She looked at me with a nervous smile and said she hoped my mother could finally find some peace. I looked at the picture of my mother on the urn and remembered the day I first brought her to Chicago from our small town. She had been so excited and curious about everything in the city. I felt like I had failed her by choosing to love the wrong woman. If it hadn't been for my mistakes, she would still be alive today. Olivia slowly knelt down on the grass next to me. I whispered a promise to my mother that in the next life, I would be the one taking care of her. When the service was over, I stood up and saw Olivia staring blankly into the distance. Olivia followed me to the car and tentatively asked if this meant I was ready to forgive her. There was a desperate kind of hope in her voice that I chose to ignore. When I told the driver to take us to the courthouse, she turned pale. She asked if I was really going to divorce her, and I just looked at her and asked what else she expected me to do. My heart felt like a block of ice. I told her that I wasn't some character in a game she was playing. I was a human being who had lost everything because of her. I asked her if she thought her money and her name made her untouchable. She just shook her head and started to cry. She finally signed the papers, and just like that, we were strangers. I couldn't get away from her fast enough and hailed the first cab I saw. A few days later, a package arrived at my door. Inside was my mother's heirloom pendant, the one she had sold years ago to help pay off Olivia's fake debts. There was a note from Olivia saying she had tracked it down and bought it back for me. She begged for my forgiveness one last time. I didn't even bother to answer her. A text from Dr. Sarah Hayes popped up on my phone. She jokingly threatened to come to my house and drag me to my follow-up appointment if I didn't show up. I actually felt a real smile touch my lips as I texted her back. It was finally time for me to start moving on with my life. That Lucas's journey serves as a poignant reminder that while others may weaponize your sincerity for their cruel games, your capacity to love and sacrifice is never a liability. It is your most profound strength. True wealth is found not in the hollow cash cakes of the elite, but in the quiet dignity of a mother's $53 legacy and the resilience of a heart that eventually chooses healing over revenge. If you have ever felt like a laughingstock for giving your all to those who didn't deserve it, know this: you were not the failure. They were simply too poor in spirit to afford the value of your soul. The greatest victory is not in overturning their golden houses, but in the courage to reclaim your own worth, leave the wreckage of betrayal behind, and walk toward a future where your sincerity is finally met with the respect it deserves.